Thank you. So this is new work, kind of new research, some new ideas going on. So I look forward to discussion about it. I don't have big conclusions yet, but I'm working on some new ideas, thinking about music, especially music after the end of the recording industry. So let's talk a little about that. I think one of the things that I'm inspired by is the idea that the future is already here, but it is unevenly distributed. That if we want to see the future, it's already happening right now. Often at the edges of cultures, at the edges of society. In sort of some ways, by definition, whatever is new is going to come from the margins, from outside the mainstream. It's kind of circular logic, but there's some truth to it. And it's something that I've witnessed myself in my research. When I started studying Japanese rap music in 1994, 1995, many of the people who were in charge, who were in power in the music industry, recording companies and music magazines and commentators, many of the elites believed that Japanese rap music would never happen. They said the language is wrong, the culture is wrong, these Japanese kids, they're just into the fashion. They don't understand hip-hop music, its connection to black culture, its connection to civil rights. And so it won't happen in Japan. And this prediction was wrong, dead wrong. And it's partly because they were in the mainstream, they were in the center of the music industry and had a hard time seeing what was happening at the margins. And I think the same thing is happening now. That if we look at the varieties of music experiments that are happening, we can start to see a future beyond the recording industry. Now there's many directions this could take. I don't think there's a single direction that will be clear immediately, but that's why I'm very curious about some of these different sides of what the future might be by looking at music as an example. Now, when I think about uneven distribution, I think I'm also quite interested in the income inequality we're seeing. These are just some numbers from the United States, but they're happening in most advanced countries, not all, but certainly the US and Japan. Sorry, there's some Italian on here because I gave this talk in Italy a few weeks ago. But what we're seeing is a rise in productivity, and since around the late 70s, around 1980, productivity rises, but wages stay flat for the average worker. And we see this kind of phenomenon portrayed various places, but for example, in this anime called C. Let's take a brief look here. So it's a portrayal of a process that we're seeing in a lot of places where jobs are going away. And the question is, where will new jobs come from? How can we imagine the origin of new kinds of industries, indeed new models for understanding the ways that people can have livelihoods? Because what we're also seeing is people moving not so much to industry jobs, but a kind of gig economy where people are moving from job to job, cobbling, working on different kinds of jobs together to make a kind of living somehow. And this is certainly true in music. In fact, music may be the original gig economy. Even the word comes from music in some ways as well. Now, this sort of magical portrayal of where value is being sucked away from, it's kind of interesting for an anime, but in the real world, we actually know where this money is going. The money's going to the very super rich at the top of society. And it's a big problem. These are the numbers for the US. Again, we can see from around 1980 that most of the income growth goes to the top 1%, and the share of income rises dramatically for the top 1%, while everyone else stays pretty flat. We might even call this a kind of zombie capitalism, because the super rich who are taking the money are often the children of, the families of wealthy people from past generations. And in fact, we're seeing this globally as well in the sharp growth in the number of billionaires. Thomas Piketty made quite a splash with his book, Capital in the 21st Century. And this is one of the graphs, that there's been a 10 times increase in the number of billionaires over about 15, 20-year time period. Okay? So I give these talks, I talk about it in my classes, but I get a certain number of responses that are very common. And these are just some examples. Like, you can't change capitalism, right? It's the only game in town. Once communism failed in the Soviet Union, what we know is that capitalism is the winning argument. What's more, if we look at communism, it seems kind of gray, kind of boring, kind of not producing a lively society of entrepreneurship and vibrancy. This is a complaint that we often hear. And so it raises the question, what might be alternative models for thinking about, if not capitalism, if not communism, might there be some kind of social economy where we think about the mixture of both economic value and social value in a more nuanced way? Okay? And one of my responses to the idea that you can't change capitalism is say, look at music. The recording industry was the main business model for music in the post-war period. But really, maybe only a 40 or 50-year history. Now, it's the history that we've experienced, but it's actually a relatively short history where recorded music was the basis for musicians' livelihoods. And so in that way, it was a little messed up in the bottom here, but in that way, music today is a natural experiment, it seems to me, in new opportunities for understanding what different economies, different social systems might look like. Now, it's not because music is unique or special, but it may be experiencing some of these changes sooner than other industries. Indeed, the kinds of changes we're seeing are similar, it seems to me, in the ways technology and cultural change is shifting how we can get value out of different kinds of goods. And this becomes very clear in songs. You can hear it in a variety of ways. This is one of the interesting songs I've heard recently, although it came out originally in 2001 at the era of Napster getting started. But this is a new version. Let's just play a bit of the chorus. Okay. So this is interesting. I don't actually agree that this is the danger, but I do think it's a very interesting and important portrayal of what a lot of musicians feel, that they've been left behind, that they spend their hours, their life learning music, practicing music, putting themselves out there for an audience that is no longer supporting them, or feels they don't need to support them, or feels that music should be free, like information should be free. And this is the kind of puzzle that musicians are facing. And yet it's worth keeping in mind that the idea of the recording industry being the only part of the music industry has always been a mistake. Jonathan Stern here, very interesting sound studies scholar, argues that as with its cultural life, music's economic life extends far beyond remediations of live performance, that is, recordings. There is no music industry, and this article is actually an argument against using that term. It's a mistake to say there's one music industry, and that industry is the recording industry. We're seeing that in a lot of ways. And instead, he says there are many industries with many relationships to music. And this is where it gets interesting. This is where a comparative perspective between different kinds of worlds of music, between different geographic settings, we could even think in terms of time as well, different historical settings, for thinking about how value itself is a very complex and uncertain category. And in some ways, one of the things I think we need to do as we're moving to a new understanding of what a social economy might be, we could call it an inclusive economy. I've heard that, more inclusive capitalism, more democratic capitalism. whatever the term is, it seems to me it requires a more substantial understanding of the social impact of our economic systems. And that to just measure things in terms of dollars and in terms of economic growth is a mistake. Because especially in cultural and social and service and knowledge and information type economies, value is very much related to its context and to the people who are using it. Indeed, one thing we can certainly agree on is that when we look at economic figures like gross national product or economic growth, at the assumption built into those numbers is that a dollar equals a dollar, right? Surely we can all agree on that, right? 100 yen is 100 yen, that's it. But clearly it's not true. If you're someone who lives on $2 a day, like a lot of people on this planet do, a dollar is a lot of money. Whereas if you're one of these billionaires, a dollar is something you don't even think about. You can't even imagine thinking about a dollar. Okay? And yet, all of our numbers, all of our economic numbers, build in this lie that a dollar is a dollar. Or at least this distortion, if not lie, it's a distortion that plays into the hands of those who have unequal distribution of wealth. Okay? So that's one of the ways we can be more subtle, more nuanced in thinking about value. But we can also see how different settings are creating different worlds of music monetization. Okay, so let's think, for example, the value of recorded music and where it comes from. This is rapidly changing, but in Japan, it's one of the last places on earth, it seems to me, that has a CD industry and a record industry. We'll talk a little bit about what that relies on, but it is remarkable because if you look at the US in 2015, only less than a third of the money came from physical sources. Streaming, like Spotify and Apple Music, made up another third, and another third comes from digital downloads from iTunes and other sources as well. Now, if we jump ahead a year, the picture is even different in the United States. Now, half of the income for recordings comes from streaming, fewer come from digital downloads, fewer come from physical objects as well. What about Japan? Is Japan finally seeing the big change coming? No. Japan actually has basically not changed in the past year. And it's kind of remarkable. And now the argument is that, well, Japan's just behind. You know, they'll catch up. The world is changing. But as we'll see, I think Japan is actually already moved beyond recorded music. It looks like things haven't changed very much in terms of recorded music being the basis of the industry in Japan. But as we'll see, people are buying CDs, but they're not buying CDs for the music. And so that's kind of interesting as well. All right, so to get a little bit into the theory here, to the extent that there's some theory here, anthropologists have long looked at value and try to argue that value is not just economic value. David Graeber, one of these anthropologists, has argued that we need to look at social systems as structures of creative action. I really like this term because it reminds us that it's not just a business, it's not just an industry we need to think of, but what are these different structures of creative action? How do they operate? What are their ethics? Where do values come out, both social and economic values? And indeed, what is value if not how people measure the importance of their own actions? You can see how this puts a very subjective element into the calculation of value. And again, it does that kind of dissolving process of saying the assumptions we have about the economy, how it works, what is money, how does money work, it throws that into a bit of a cloud and says we need to explore this more carefully and think about the variety of settings in which money has different kinds of values. And this is where I get really speculative, but I've been thinking about this. I'm like, well, how to portray this? What is another way of thinking about value? If things aren't flat, what's a way of conceiving of value in different ways? What about taking inspiration from Einstein and the difference between Newtonian flat world physics and Einstein's curvature of space-time? This might be an interesting metaphor to play with. It is just a metaphor, I should say. It doesn't really prove anything because physics works this way. Doesn't necessarily mean the social world works this way. But I think it's an interesting idea to think about, well, if the world is curved, right? If our social world is curved in some ways, and if in physics the curvature comes from gravity, what might be those things that curve our social world? Because I think we experience it that way. At least I think I experience it that way. And so it's kind of interesting. And so to think, well, what are some different examples of worlds that we might explore for understanding this curvature of music after the recording industry? I want to talk about a few different examples. Music festivals, pop idols, crowdfunding as an example of new approaches to music, and also Vocaloids, virtual idols. These are some of the examples I'm thinking about. There's many more I'm playing with too, but let's talk briefly about some of these today. Okay. The interesting question, though, is if there is a curvature, what is gravity in this model? And I don't know, actually. This actually is a bit of a problem. Now, the quick and easy answer, it seems to be, is money. This is always what people say in cultural studies. If you want to know how power works, follow the money. The problem with that argument is that I don't think that's how it works. In studying how hip-hop emerged in Japan, and looking at how Japanese animation became a global phenomenon, in both cases, the idea that you just follow the money ends up being a very poor, incomplete explanation of what happens. Nevertheless, there is some power to money. It clearly curves things, but it's not the only thing. And I think, well, what's the opposite of money? Well, maybe it's intimacy. You know, some kind of intimacy is what really matters, and that's being able to get close to something is something that draws us near. Being able to get close to other people is certainly something that draws us to others. Maybe it works in other social realms as well. In music, there's also something about people who are really into sound, and good sound, and interesting sounds, and sounds that expand our minds and expand our world and expand our experiences. It's a whole different kind of category, actually, but it seems to me this might be another way of thinking about curvature. And what about audiences? If you're a musician and you say, well, I can go to this one show that has 5 people attending it, and I go to another show that has 100 people attending it, I'm going to be pulled towards that larger audience, or maybe even a more specialized audience. All of these things are ways of imagining how there's a curvature built into our worlds that we can see by the way people act around it. Of course, I think there can be many other examples too. These categories don't line up well. I'm not sure what to do with them, but I think there might be something in here for thinking about curvature. All right, if that's the abstract level of some of the things I'm thinking about, let's look at some particular examples. One of the reasons I came to Japan this week was to attend this music festival. A friend of a friend is organizing it, and I went to it last year, and it's really a remarkable thing. Maybe about 500-600 people go to this festival. It's at Shirahama Flower Park in Chiba. This is what it looks like. Here you sort of have flower fields here. There's a main stage and this sort of pool area over here. This is a big banana plantation underneath here. You can see it's right along the water. And they have music inside here, music here, and then music over in another stage right there. And what's interesting is, and you can see it better in this picture, this place is falling down. This place is in ruins. This is a leisure resort, probably, I assume, created in the 90s at the height of the bubble economy, imagining a new leisure economy of the future where people would drive an hour and a half, 2 hours from Tokyo to spend a weekend with all of their extra money having fun at the beach. But it hasn't worked out that way. That economy fell apart. People build this, and you can even see this thing is falling down. It's got holes in the top here. The hotel is not too fancy, and it's a bit beaten up. So in normal terms, for a resort, there's very little value here, actually. It's fairly cheap to go. And yet by having a music festival here, it draws people in, right? It has that kind of attractive power that makes it a very special and exciting place. It's a techno music festival. Jipangu is what it's called. Only Japanese artists. I think that's one of the interesting things about this festival, with a variety of quite interesting folks. Artists as well involved in making the flyers. Here's a larger list of the artists. In fact, there's even more artists than this. It happens from Saturday around 3 p.m. until the next day, 5 p.m. on Sunday. It's a huge festival. Here we go. This is inside the jungle area. Here's an outside area at night. You can see it's all nicely lit up with various art and lighting projects as well. There's live painting that goes on. 6 artists work all night to make this canvas with 6 different paintings on it. And one of the moments that really struck me and said, you know, this is a good example of the kind of commitment you get to people that goes beyond money, that goes beyond comfort even. It started raining around midnight at the show. Water started pouring in to the jungle area. Everybody's getting wet. There's not much to do about it. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but here it is, 6 a.m. There's more people, but not too many people. Piles of water are now filling up here. You can see you can't quite see it, but there's a waterfall happening right here. And here are the 2 sound guys wiping off the computer because it's got water falling on it, and still working to make the sound really good. They're discussing, they've got their iPad, they got the computer, they're adjusting all the effects so that it sounds really good in there. They're not musicians, they're just on the margins of this project, but they're committed to this larger goal that says this should sound good, even though it's raining, even though we're standing in the mud, even though we've been up for 24 hours at least, we're here to make this something special. And it's interesting how it does draw people together, right? This is one way that we can see this kind of curvature that happens. The DJs, the live music, the dancing, that's the central part. But it also brings together food trucks. There's this nice sort of healthy food truck area here. There's a little market here where they're selling t-shirts, jewelry, leather work, and other kinds of things as well. And so it's a very interesting kind of example of where you can make value out of nothing by drawing together interesting people and drawing together interesting music. Okay? We see this more generally with live music as well, and this is perhaps just a more extreme example. All right, if this is one model, the live music, the music festival model for what can happen for musicians after records, another model, and I keep wondering, how different is it? How much the same is it? Is, of course, pop music idols. The queens of pop music idols, as we know, AKB48. There's other examples as well. But this is another remarkable example. And in fact, it's this model that's holding up the CD industry in Japan. Many people argue. I tend to agree. Of course, here he is, Akimoto Yasushi. He wants to make this Aini Ikeru Idoru. So he says, that's the problem with idols. You can only see them on TV. You can only see them in magazines. I will make idols that you can go meet. And he started with these daily shows in Akihabara. Fans could go up and shake the hands of the girls afterwards. It created this sort of new understanding of what idols could be. Some of these slides you don't need because you live in Japan. There we go, Akiba, AKB. There's their cafe and shop. And as it built over the years, one of the things it was able to do was create this new scale, a kind of huge scale for the general election. And people are probably familiar, but let's take a quick look just to get a sense of what the AKB general election looks like in the Tokyo. And the scale is incredible, right? I mean, and it's quite amazing what they managed to do. And yet, what's also interesting about this is that when AKB is selling all of these CDs, like a lot of idol groups are these days, they're not selling these CDs so people can listen to the music, but rather when you buy the CD, as you probably know, when you buy the CD, you can vote for the girl you want to support. You can get a lottery ticket to go see a show. You can get a ticket to go to the shake hands events. In other words, there's all of this sort of sales technique that happens. These numbers are a little old, right? Vote for the center, collect photos, right? Some people are buying many copies of the CD so they can get the photo of the girl they want, shake hands events. So what's interesting here is that, in a way, at least in the early days of AKB, now that it's gotten so big, it's less effective at this, it seems to me. But one of the things these CDs are selling is access. It's a kind of intimacy and participation in the worlds of these musicians. There's some argument about how fake or how real it is. Suffice it to say, it's real enough, I think, for some of the people, that this works to offer a new model for selling CDs and for selling access, participation, intimacy. I would add that this is not unique to Japan. I think it takes a little different shape in different places. But in the US, I've talked to musicians who say, you know, we make more money at the VIP meet and greet. In other words, at the kind of party they have before the show for select fans who pay extra. They say, we make more money on that than we make on the show. So this idea of access to the musicians is not unique to Japan, but certainly the idol world is taking it to a new level. The other thing that's interesting here that I've noticed going to these pop idol shows, just a few of them, is that the audience does not take pictures. The audience has been asked not to take pictures. They all have their phone with them, but they've been told, please don't take pictures, and they don't take pictures. So this has helped these businesses monetize the selfies afterwards. So if you want a picture with the girls, you need to pay for that privilege, and people are willing to do it. And partly they're willing to do it because these idols are also, I've gone to smaller shows, not the AKB shows, but at some of the smaller shows, it's 800, 1,000 people. The girls, the idols will say, without you, I'm nothing. Without you, without the support of you, our audience, we have no meaning, we have no value. We need you. And they've developed this kind of narrative of legitimacy that's quite effective, I think, and maybe provides an interesting model for thinking about how you develop this sense of responsibility. Again, so people start to say, well, I should pay something. Even though I can get this for free, I should pay something. And to me, that's a kind of interesting lesson of this idol world. I spent a little time in Berlin recently, too, where there's a kind of middle ground. So in Japan, at least at the idol shows, people don't take photos with their phones. In America, everybody's got their phone. Filming, photoing, all the time. It's kind of interesting. I went to this club in Berlin. One of the big clubs there is called Berghain. And at Berghain, when you go in, they search you, they do the body search. And when they get your phone, here, I got one even. They take this little sticker, they do a little round sticker, and they put it over top of your lenses. One on the front, one on the back. Now, of course, you can just peel off the sticker, but you know you're doing something wrong. And it's kind of interesting, in between, right? It's in between. They do it. So what's interesting here is that there's a mix of social value, economic value, technology, cultural, ethics get mixed together. And this is a natural part of our life, actually. There's all sorts of ways in which economic commodities are mixed with social values. Now, just to give some ideas of how this works, here's a common example. You go to a liquor store, you buy a bottle of wine, you pay the money, you get the wine, your relationship with the liquor store is over. You don't owe them anything, they don't owe you anything. But as you walk to your friend's house, put a ribbon on the bottle of wine and give it to someone, that commodity has been magically transformed into a gift, where the dollar amount doesn't matter. What matters is that you owe something. Somebody owes you something. And so it introduces a kind of tension into that relationship. And we can see this kind of gift economy working in a lot of ways, and it's a very interesting world. Now, it can go the other way as well. There are examples of things that were once a social value, but that become a commodity. Now, often this is talked about as a good thing. This is a way that business models emerge, right? Shaking hands with somebody. Now you have to pay for that if that person is an idol. And you should expect to pay for it. Otherwise, you're not supporting the idol. But it can go another way as well. It can also make it bad. Now, here's the example. It's a little odd, this example. Pardon me for doing it. OK, I'm traveling. I meet a lovely woman. We have a crazy night. And I think, oh, that's lovely. But the next day, I look at the table next to the bed, and she gave me money? What? OK, this doesn't really happen. But for example, actually, this is my wife, too, I should say. She doesn't know. She's in the slide. But anyway, this is an example. We say, well, this was a real something that's now turned into garbage because I've gotten money for it. Okay? So this is an example that there's this sort of fluid space between the social and the economic. And what's more, value itself is fluid. It can change over time. You know, I look at my fellow students, I look at my students, I say, well, how good is it to get older? And they say, well, it's quite clear, you know? You know, I look at you, professor, and I'd rather die, you know, than be you. But we say, no, what are you talking about? You know, it's really just the opposite, you know? That the value just gets better over time, and you guys just don't know. I'm sorry, but you don't know, right? So that value is also something, this is another one of those sort of lies or confusions that's built into our economic analysis. When we say the value is set when the money changes hands. But that's not true. That's absolutely not true, and in fact, it's probably especially not true in music. So I just did this example. I thought, well, what is the value of a song for me as time goes on? So let's just try this out. Of course, most songs aren't worth anything, but maybe there's a song that I really like. How does that work? Well, at first, I don't know the song, so it has no value. Then I hear it, I'm like, hey, that's a pretty good song. All right, now I buy it. Now I start listening to it over and over and over and over and over. I'm listening to it, it's great. Oh, now I don't want to listen to it anymore. I'm sick of it. Oh, no, I really don't want to hear it anymore. It just reminds me of how much time I waste in my life. And then I forget about it for a while. It doesn't count anything. Then I hear it on the radio. I'm like, hey, that's right. That's a pretty good song. I like that song. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to put it in my DJ mix. Let's see how that works. OK, I put it in my DJ mix at a party. It goes great. Oh, my God. Now this is a really great song. I love this song because it worked in a party. Everybody danced. It was terrific. I'm like, I'm going to try that again. I try it again. It totally fails. Everybody leaves the dance floor. Now it's just a symbol of my deep embarrassment and my failure as a DJ to ever do anything right. I don't want to hear the song at all. Little time passes. I'm like, I still like the song. It's OK. So there's this way in which value is really complex and unfolds in different ways over time. Now, I don't know how it would be possible to work this into an economic model, but at least it reminds us that we shouldn't take these numbers for granted. And in too many ways, our politics, our economic decision-making hinges on these misconceptions about value. And so I think, and music really sort of makes this especially clear. All right. And so one of the things that's interesting is that when I did my hip hop research, actually, here's the book, Hip Hop Japan, that Kyle kindly uses. By the way, you can get my books for free. And please feel free to download my books at academia.edu. Both the English and the Japanese versions are available online. And it's legal, actually. My publisher was willing to do the books as a Creative Commons license, so you're allowed to download them. You just can't sell them. That's the rule. But so for this research on the hip-hop book, I started studying musicians, but then I realized it was really the interaction between the musicians and the fans and this kind of feedback loop in live spaces that was important for understanding the emergence of Japanese rap music, which has a long history going back to Buddha Brand up to groups like Kakuto and a variety of groups today. And one of the things that struck me in sort of thinking about the music scene as a whole is how the early stages of becoming a musician, when one is new, developing an interest, studying, collecting music, practicing at home, there's this whole area in which you're still a fan, but you're starting to become a musician. Then you have some amateur events, you do some freestyles, maybe a guest gig. But you don't really get paid until you start getting up in the higher level of performing artists and then recording. This is a little old, now there's not so much of the recording artists to think about, but this is an image that was in the book. And what struck me is that this whole space at the bottom was more about social value, and you couldn't even talk about the economic value of music until you were in a kind of different area of what music was about. And you can see this all sorts of ways. You can see it in musicians who are experimenting with music, who say, look, I know music is free, but there should still be a way, for me to make money at it, for us to make money at it. An example of that might be taken from this brief music video clip from Shingo Nishinari. Let's take a look at this. All right, a little bit. CD de koenai. I can't eat with CDs, but I don't have time to talk about that. I don't have time to worry about that. I was talking to a DJ the other day who was complaining about how he sells his 500 vinyl records for a relatively low price and then watches that price go up online, and then dealers will sell his album at that extra price, but he doesn't get any of it. And he was sort of complaining about this, but then he says, you know what? It's really uncool to worry about this, so I don't worry about it. Which I thought was kind of interesting. You know, it's just another take on how it goes. But what it also means is that whatever solutions musicians have to find for this new world in which everything is free, it's up to us as listeners, it's up to us as music fans to be part of that solution. And I think it reminds us that what other people have noticed, again, to get back to David Graeber, that he argues that all social systems, and even capitalism, have always been built upon a bedrock of actually existing communism. I get a lot of response to this, say that's not communism, we don't want to do communism, and I'm open on what to call it. That's why I've been calling it maybe a social economy right now. But the communism he's talking about is everyday communism. And the example is if someone asks you for directions, if someone asks you what time it is, you're going to support it. You know, you're going to do it even if it takes away some of your time. And he gives the example too, says, say you work in a bank. Even in a bank, if the person working at the desk next to you says, can I borrow a pen? You say, yeah, give me $1. Actually, give me $5. Then I'll give you that pen, right? There's no way. You wouldn't do it. It's not allowed. And it's not allowed because that's the social world we live in. We do have rules, and the rules are communist, actually, even in this capitalist world, even in a capitalist setting like a bank. And so this is another example of how the social and the economic are complexly mixed. And that too often our analysis ignores that complexity. Okay, how can fans be part of this? Well, one of the interesting things is crowdfunding. This is a musician I'm quite interested in, Amanda Palmer. She's part of this group called Dresden Dolls. but she's been more on her solo and other kinds of partnerships projects right now. And she started this thing on Patreon. Patreon is patreon.com here is one of these crowdfunding sites where you sign up. I've signed up for it, and you can say, each time Amanda releases a thing, it might be a painting or a song or a video, that I will pay. $1, $3, whatever it is. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is sort of another take on how musicians can gain a livelihood. A big part of it is that she sends emails pretty much once a week. Those are free, but it develops this sense of intimacy, the sense of closeness, the story that I need you in order to do my work. And she even has this kind of intimacy idea here. If Kickstarter was like dating, this is more like having a long-term relationship, and it's quite interesting. Okay, so crowdfunding, that's another possibility, another way that the social and the economic are mixed. And I only have a few minutes left, but I'll give a couple more examples just to think about, because one of the things that I've been interested in, and sort of as I study, I'm an anthropologist, we do field work, participant observation, and one of the big questions we always face in doing research is, where should we do that research? Where is the action for understanding whatever world we're interested in? Because there's always too many possibilities. And one of the kinds of places I've become very interested in, and it's sort of how I found Jipangu, is the kind of underground DJ scene that's happening in Tokyo. One of the places for this is a bar called Bonobo in Jingumae. I've been fortunate to be able to go to a few events there. One of my fellow DJs is here, Nick Cage. And it's a very interesting space. So for example, the headliner who played at Jipangu in Chiba, DJ Nobu, it was about, it was a 500-600 person event. He goes to Berlin regularly to play at this giant club Berghain in front of 3,000 or 4,000 people. But he also comes to Bonobo to play. And this place is tiny. It's hard to believe how tiny. It holds about 15 people comfortably. I've seen 50 people in there, but you don't want to be there in that situation. But it's usually 10, 15, 20 people is the size of this. And you say, well, why? He's not getting much money, if any money, for this. Why would a guy like Nobu come to a place like this? And this is, again, there's some kind of curvature going on here that I'm not quite sure. But I think part of it is that the audience, even though it's 10 or 15 people, is a very expert audience. So that you can try out new things that you maybe wouldn't try out at a music festival with 3,000 people. You can try out more experimental stuff. The sound is really incredible here too, and it's actually one of the interesting things about this place. I've talked to the owner a bit, and he's very excited about how good he is at making the sound, and he's right. I mean, the music fills up the space, and yet you can still talk. He's got giant speakers in the back, giant speakers in the front, even though the whole room is about up to here. And then he's got the timing worked out so that the sound waves meet just in the center, just in the right way, because there's a slight delay of a few milliseconds on the back speakers. This kind of thing, I think, doesn't matter to a lot of people. But if you're a musician, this is really exciting. And it's really interesting, and it's really fun. And you can sort of understand the music that you're into in a new way. And it also becomes a space where networking with other artists is very much why you go there. Because as I've gotten to know some of the people who attend this, they're not just musicians. They all have music interests, but some are in design, some are in art, some are in advertising, some are organizers of events and other things. And so that there's a way in which learning and expertise, or learning to get new expertise, is a very important thing if you're a musician as well. And so, just sort of, I'm trying to finish up here, and then we can get to the discussion. So, for the people who are arguing for a kind of post-capitalist politics, and one of these authors is a pair of these authors are J.K. Gibson Graham. That's their pen name. It's two women, but they write under the single pen name. And this is the argument they make in their book, Post-Capitalist Politics. If we begin to see non-capitalist activities as prevalent and viable, we may be encouraged here and now to actively build on them to transform our local economies. And I think this is important because there's many ways in which capitalist markets and wage labor really are just the tip of an iceberg that includes all kinds of different forms of exchange and production and consumption. It's a totally random list of things here, but it's kind of fun because of that. Again, this is an image from that book. But what we see is that there's all different ways that things are produced and made. And what's more, if we think about sort of monetization of music as well, it got me thinking that there's this whole process by which, there's the preparing and production that leads up to making an album, and then once the album is out, that music gets in public. And that either you can get that money early on with patrons, you can actually make the object, then sell the object. That's another possibility. There's another thing that you make the object, you release the object, and then you find ways to make money on it later. And this is another way that we sort of need to factor in a time element, all right? Or think about how value and exchange can really happen at different moments of time. And this is one that's really confusing. I haven't really sorted this one out yet. But I started thinking, yeah, you know what? In fact, this is the interesting thing about music, is that it's totally different value for different people. That the same song, this is what's interesting. Everybody listens to the same song. But some people listen to it for free. Right? So, so I call this the skate park of engagement. Again, I'm trying to get to think about different curvature things, potential energy. But you can think, if the producers make music and you got consumers down here, some just listen on the radio, suffer through ads, other people start paying for subscriptions, now you're paying $10 a month. It's the same music that comes up. Now you say, hey, I'm going to go to the live show. That's pretty cool. Oh, I'm going to buy a t-shirt at the live show. Oh, all right, no, I'm going to be a crowdfunder here. I'm going to do that. Say, no, I'm going to become an angel, VIP meet and greet. I'm going to pay $150 and I'm going to go see the person. Wait, I'm going to become an angel investor and pay a lot for a band. It's the same music that comes out, but the kind of potential energy that's built into your sense of engagement works differently. I'd like to get a better image for here, but anyway, this is an idea as well for saying, well, if we work this curvature idea, what does it enable us to see? And so that's basically the last thing. The last thing I was going to say a little bit about the Vocaloids, Hatsune Miku, voice synthesizer software. You buy the software. It looks like this. Here we go. You open the software. Here's how it works. You type in lyrics. There's the keyboard on that side, and the software sings. It sings pretty well. But what's more is the company Krypton Future Media that released this releases a character to go with it. There's a bunch of these Vocaloid characters. People start making songs, uploading them to Nico Nico. The commentary continues. People make images to go with the songs. And eventually, after a few years, Sega makes a video game to go with the music. All right. Amazing. It's amazing, right? It's just amazing. And I get this a lot. If people call me up and say, hey, what is with this? How is those crazy Japanese? How is it? They dress up in costume. They go look at cartoons dancing on stage. I don't understand it at all, people say to me. And I look at these people, they're talking to me about cosplay. They say, oh, I can't believe people doing cosplay. And I look at the person, and he's dressed head to toe in Boston sports outfits. I say, that's cosplay. You're in cosplay. He says, no, this is totally different. This is Tom Brady. He's the greatest quarterback of all time. It's no comparison. I said, well, okay. And what's interesting is, so a lot of the attention on the outside has been how strange these concerts are. So weird. Why? What's so weird? Look at this virtual pop star. It's not a hologram, by the way. I have friends who do holograms. They say you should tell people this is not a hologram. It's just a projection on glass. But what are you going to do? People call it a hologram. But what's interesting is the show is not the interesting thing. What's interesting is all the fan-made stuff around it. So there's also these events where people can sell fan objects, CDs, DVDs. There's free software for making videos. And that each of these different styles of Miku are accepted by the company. They say they're equally valid, equally legitimate, and that in fact the company's approach to copyright is very interesting because they say, yes, Miku is copyrighted, we, Krypton, own the copyright, but that if you're making things for non-commercial uses, like downloading my book, you don't have to ask for permission, you don't have to do anything, you're welcome to do it. And if you go to one of these fan conventions and sell things, that's okay too, but we want to know what you're making. So you send a copy of what you're making to the company, they send you a QR code to show that it's legitimate. Now you don't owe any money, but if you start making a lot of money, then we need to negotiate. That's what Krypton Future Media says. And so it's very interesting how they've built in a process that's actually very similar to other areas of music. This is actually the unofficial model for sampling among DJs as well. That if you're a wealthy musician, you need to pay for using a sample. If you're an underground DJ, you can often get away with it because there's not much use in suing you anyway. Okay? So this is that's the idea, that there's a bunch of different ways we can think about these social economies, right? There's ways live performance is evolving, merchandising participation among the idols. Keeping in mind that to become a musician, it's a process of learning and evolving constantly. And that finding spaces where one can learn and evolve is very important to musicians, in some ways more important than making money. And this is something that I'm trying to figure out how to work in. Crowdfunding, again, a different relationship for thinking about how consumerism works. And then the Vocaloids as well show that building the community and then making money on it can be a winning operation. And so the conclusion is that there are all these different ways to think of the value of music. There's not just the point of sale. Value shifts over time. Audiences and their intimacy matter a lot in thinking about the value. And that social value and economic value complexly curve the worlds that we move in. That it's not just about technology. It's not just about sort of what you can and cannot do, but what you should and should not do that's part of it. So that cultural norms are key here. And that this is one of the things that the musicians have been arguing. It's frustrating that everything is free. Young people don't care about owning music. But I think one of the interesting things is ownership hasn't gone completely away. And I think the example of that is everybody taking pictures on their phones. That they want their own memory, their own image of that. And selfies too are kind of interesting. Like you want your own version of that. I think ownership actually hasn't gone completely away, just as authorship hasn't gone completely away with the loss of copyright. So in conclusion, the idea is that we face great challenges in trying to understand the inequality of our times. But part of that means having a more nuanced understanding of what new economies can look like. Rethinking value in terms of its balance of social value and economic value. These experiments are happening right now, all over the place. And not just in music. I'm focusing on music, but one could find these dynamics in many different areas, I think. And so that by looking at them, by trying to analyze what are the mix of ethics, technology, social value, economic value that's happening in the different spaces, it seems to me we might come up with very innovative and as yet things that haven't been experimented with enough in order to tackle some of the big problems of our day. Thank you very much.
I'll just start out here with the question, and then we'll open this up to the audience and welcome you all to come up and ask a question. Ian, I've known your work since you were working on Japanese hip-hop and seen that this has evolved over time here. How do you connect this back to where the music industry was, particularly with the underground hip-hop, like in the late 90s, when you were here doing your doctoral research, and how that's evolved? And how do you connect this also to your work on anime?
Sure. Yeah, so when I wrote the hip-hop book, it was a study in globalization, local culture versus global culture. And that's the story the book tells. As I look back on it now, I see another angle on it that relates more to this work, in the sense that how does something like hip-hop become an industry that didn't exist, right? In the 70s, in the 80s, early 80s, there was no hip-hop industry. And yet a new industry emerges. So that's kind of interesting. And for me, the argument is that it came out of these nightclubs, that the recording companies didn't get it, the recording studios didn't get it, the radio people didn't get it, even the magazine people mostly didn't get it. So by having this space where artists and musicians and promoters and writers like me could come together, that created enough of a community that then grew and expanded, and these competed with the underground and the pop scene. They all competed with each other until Japanese hip hop became a thing. With the anime example, it's a little embarrassing to say this, but so for the music, the hip hop work, I went to the clubs and I got to know the artists. So for the anime project, I did the same thing. I said, well, let's go to the studios, let's meet the creators. And I studied the history of animation. I wrote that book. I think it's okay. But what I learned was that I studied the wrong thing, actually. That what made anime successful was really the manga industry. This is the way I would explain it now. And why is manga so special? There's a bunch of things going on, but one of the aspects that makes manga really interesting as a media space is that it's virtually free to access manga. Sure, people will buy a few copies of it, but they'll pass it around to their friends. And then they'll be standing and reading at the convenience store. At least this was back in the day. Now everybody's reading them online, but it's similar. But because manga is free, that people are into it, could really listen to it, read a lot of it and check a lot of it. And the publishers were very good at understanding that interest and ranking their artists. And so the top manga, which is what becomes the anime, have battled it out week after week, year after year. So I give credit. I'm not a huge fan of like One Piece, but I am impressed that the author has been able to keep doing it, right, and keep winning. And so because manga is free, I think, it opens up the competitiveness of that space. And that because the industry has been responsive in finding out what people like and not trying to force it on people like Hollywood does, that it creates a very open space that allows the good stuff, at least for that audience, to bubble to the top. And I think the same thing's happening now. And in fact, that's why I think music being free will be very good in the long run for music, because it should flatten the playing field and allow these different sort of curvatures to emerge based on audiences less than a kind of marketing and monopoly power as it used to be.
It's really interesting. You have this concept which you call Gemba globalism, which I take to mean like the place where it happens. So it's interesting that both in your hip hop work and what you're talking about there, you're talking about physical performance spaces in a world that's all virtual and online. How do you deal with that dynamic?
Yeah, but online spaces are also communication, also Gemba as well, right? If the Gemba is a place where people interact and something becomes actualized, then of course that can happen online. And I don't think, how virtual is the virtual world? I don't know. I mean, I always say if you can get fired by email, how's that virtual? That's about as real as it gets, So just because you got it by email, or, people said the same thing about phones, right? That phones were, there was this distance, it was virtual, it was robbing people of social interaction. And there's some truth to that. But I still think you get a lot through the phone, just like you get a lot through email. So I don't think we talk about virtual worlds so much anymore. We talk about virtual reality, right? Which I think at one point would have been seen as a paradox. And now it's the big thing.
That's interesting. A different paradigm. Everyone, don't be shy. Come up and speak. Please come to the mic, and you can even line up. You should note that we are video recording this for our online presence. So,
thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask a little bit about just something you talked about, the idea
Tell
of...
me a little bit about who you are.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm sorry.
I'm Lindsay Nelson. I'm a professor at Meiji University, and I specialize in Japanese film. I wanted to hear a little bit more about this idea of sort of the commodification of intimacy and authentic experiences. And I feel like in the U.S. right now, there's a lot of tension between situations where artists and fans are kind of in a DIY fashion, trying to make connections with people and get their work out there. But then large companies are kind of swooping in and finding ways to monetize this while seeming as if they're very homespun and very simple. And I know that Amanda Palmer got a lot of criticism when she raised a huge amount of money and then offered to pay the people who collaborated with her with hugs and beer. And I was just wondering if any similar conversations were happening in Japan around this with artists or fans or companies, talking about the difference between sort of fan-driven and creative-driven enterprise and, companies like Johnny's and others trying to monetize this need for access and intimacy.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, it's kind of that fundamental one, right? What about co-optation? What about the big companies just taking over in the name of authentic intimacy and then just making money on it? Yeah, everybody's talking about it. I mean, I don't know the simple solution is the trick, and that I guess, and this is where I'm still sort of in the early stages of this project and trying to figure out how it could all fit together, or to what extent to even try to fit it together. It is, I have heard that criticism of Amanda Palmer, and she's no doubt very aware of it as well. And it doesn't sound good to me, that's true. It's also not so unusual, and there's a lot of that goes on. What I think is that it's going to take, that we can't expect the companies to sort this out. I guess that's my take on it. And that, like the elites in the recording industry, it was the same thing in the US. The people in the recording industry in the 70s and 80s didn't like hip hop. They were all rock guitar people. They didn't get it. The people weren't singing, they were sampling music. None of it made sense as music. Because they came from a different place. And you look at how elites talk about copyright, and they're fighting for the artists, and that's what they're doing. I do think the incumbents are going to be the last people to get it. And so the artists are sort of stuck in the middle, but where there's a chance is for us as the fans. And it seems to me that's where the change has to come. And us saying, hey, there used to be a time when record companies would support underground artists. Now they don't really do that. So now we have to step up and do that. How can we start to see that? And so that's where, I'm even a little more sympathetic to some of these idols, because at least they're making that argument. And I've heard this, there's not a lot of love for the AKB guy Akimoto, I think. By the same token, I've heard people say they respect him because when everybody else was complaining that everybody's just pirating music and stealing and not respecting the artists and not respecting what we do, they said, well, Akimoto said, it's the world we live in, and let's try something new. Let's try something different. And so, I think Amanda Palmer is trying that. She's not the only one doing this. And she, in ways they're almost more susceptible, I think, to criticism, because much more gross things happen where they're hiding the money. Like you look at what happens with Coachella or something. Nobody knows where all that money goes, and people are happy as long as they don't know. So it's complicated. But I would say, instead of us always looking to the artist or to the companies to change, that we also got to look to how can I change? How could I, if I used to buy CDs, I don't buy CDs anymore. Maybe I should be pitching in to a handful of artists. And am I doing that enough? And I should say, too, for the college students in the audience, I think it's no problem when you don't have money to just steal it all, to take it all. I think it's important, frankly. If the choice is pay for it or, need to feel you have to pay for it and don't listen to it, or listen to it and don't pay for it, it's always better to access it and hear it. And I was right when I was in Berlin hanging out with some musicians, too. They were really funny too, because they would complain about how nobody pays for music, but then they say, "Oh, Ian, you don't know this Japanese music? Say, here, give me your flash drive," and they'll load up to like 30 CDs. You know, I say, "Well, start with this. Start with this, and I'll get you some more once you've gone through these 30." And say, "Oh yeah, Ian, here's these 20 CDs. You've got to listen to them. Here, start ripping them. Okay." So even they are, they'll talk one way, but on balance, they're like, you need to listen to a lot more music, and that's what most musicians will tell you. Is that, yeah, you're okay, Ian, you listen to a fair amount, but you gotta get to work. So that's part of it. So I learned from that. Good. What else, please?
Yes, my question is,
Do you mind introducing yourself too?
Ron McFarlane. I am possibly the only business person in the room.
No problem.
With a sales background.
Great.
And I've been here for 40 years, and I've worked nothing but for Japanese companies.
Great. Thank you.
That's basically me. My question is, looking at the way the music industry has changed with the internet and such, up to now, it's been a drastic change. And now, with technology coming, particularly blockchain and cryptocurrency, and encrypting your music and protecting your music, how is this going to impact on our musicians out there in the future? And how is the industry going to evolve, let's say, in the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I really don't know. Right, what do I think? First of all, I would say I have seen some interesting experiments with blockchain. One group I know in Boston is trying to use blockchain to have more efficient licensing of music. I'm not convinced that's going to solve a lot of problems, but at least it could make licensing a more open possibility and less susceptible to the middleman problem of ASCAP and BMI and the Harry Fox agency. There's a few groups that manage all that distribution. Do we really need them, I guess, is what the Open Music Initiative is asking. There's technology for locking down music, right? Digital rights management, DRM. It won't work, is what I think. And I come to that conclusion not as someone who knows about it, but from reading an essay by Cory Doctorow, who's thought a lot about these issues. He's a science fiction writer, but also nonfiction writer. And he says the problem with all anti-piracy measures is that in order to play the music, you have to give someone the key. So if you have to be able to play the music, you have to have the key, so there's actually no way to stop that, because you always have to give out the key. And so that was his argument, that there's a logical impossibility to locking it down. And so I think one of the parts of the future will be that things will be free, and that free is likely to expand and increase. The other thing I see happening is people listening to a lot more music now because of that. And then I think as that happens, you find people using music in more personal ways, where you can be your own DJ in your own room and have access to the most bizarre music that used to had to be a pretty specialized DJ to find and go to the record store and know what to look for. That's all opened up to people now. And I was talking with a guy I've known who's run a club in Shibuya now for 20-some years, and he was pointing out that, he's like, I have a 17-year-old daughter, and she doesn't feel any need to go to a club because she can hang out with her friends in a room and have club music and do her own thing. And I thought that was very interesting. And on the one hand, he was not happy as a club owner or a club manager for that. But he also said, we have to live with this, and maybe we can make a club a different kind of space then. Maybe there's other kinds of things a club could do, thinking about different ages of audiences and using it as a learning environment of various kinds, opening it up for a more, I know this one place in Boston that has kind of karaoke for DJs, where you, instead of going and picking out a song you want to sing, you bring your records and you get to play your records in the club. I was like, oh, that, I could see that catching on, and that might be interesting. And then you might bring your friends, because it'd be a little different to play your records in the club. And so I just think it opens up a lot of possibilities that we'll have to see. Beyond that, I'm not sure. Thanks. Please.
Hi. My name is Wes. I'm just a college student here. My question was, you talked a lot about how like the initiative is changing towards like a community first in the entertainment sector, and like how in the music industry and then the film and other industries, that seems to be a trend that's increasing. Do you think that that idea of like a community first mentality and building based on community involvement will go outside of the entertainment sector at all?
No, it already is, and I mean, I think inarguably, it started outside of the entertainment world as well. I mean, you think of co-ops, you think of community gardens. I don't know, when I'm trying to get my sons to help clean up the dinner, I'm like, this was the original crowdsourcing. You know, families. I mean, it's not actually an unusual concept. I think what's unusual is that we've lost touch with that concept in thinking about what a business model is, you know, or where we draw our lines around a business. So, no, I think I think this community-centered approach actually applies to all sorts of things, and that, you know, if you like, as I was reading the histories of Japanese animation, not so many people talked about the importance of manga being virtually free. But a few people did, and I say, oh, actually, that gives you this community-first understanding of what a business actually is. And you see this with economists as well. So Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he argues that the current problems we're having with the economy in like Japan and the US has a lot to do with the stagnant incomes of everybody but the 1%. And that if that income had been shared more widely, or if from now it gets shared more widely, then people have more money to spend and it'll get pumped right into new kinds of businesses in local communities. And so that's the argument that people are making sort of across the spectrum. I think one of the things we can do, those of us interested in this, are show different examples of how that actually works. You know, people have said, oh, co-ops don't work. You know, I've had this debate with people as well. They say, well, co-ops have never really taken off, or this kind of community-based labor has never really been a successful part of our world, at least for the last, say, 500 years. I think that's not true. You know, what about families? You know, how families, you know, people aren't getting paid to be families, and yet that's there. And you look at how school, you know, educational institutions work too. I mean, we get paid, but we could make more money elsewhere, but there's also sort of more satisfaction and interest in being part of a larger project, to working with students, that makes it that much more exciting and interesting. So I don't know, I'm not so pessimistic, but I think it's up to us to emphasize where it's working and how it could work better.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Nico Sternsdorf. I teach anthropology at Southern Methodist University. Thank you for your talk. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask you, as you lay out sort of this new sort of terrain for the music industry, and I found really interesting your ideas of the centers of gravity and the ways in which that they might pull people in different directions. But I wanted to ask you, in your conversation so far with musicians, how is this having an impact on the artistry side of things, on the way in which they conceive of their music as art and as something that they want to push forward? And then once you move it into these terrains that you've described, do things change a little bit there?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the ways things have changed is that there's more openness about drawing from all sorts of genres and feeling a little bit more open about sampling and appropriating, that I think is actually very healthy. And so I think, you know, if anything, it's made people stretch out a little bit more. One of the, I asked this DJ the other day, I said, so what's your genre of playing music? And he says, well, he called it heads. And now I've heard different definitions of what heads means, but what I heard from him in explaining it was, it's not, I don't play a genre, and I don't play a particular era either. He says, my goal is to play music that for people who really like music and listen to a lot of music, that will surprise them. So sometimes I'll go to the 1950s and pull out this little song, or I'll do this brand new remix over here, and it'll be techno, and then I'll go down and hear this bluesy gospel, and I'll pull that out. And so to me, I thought, well, this wouldn't have been so easy and would not have been an art form so well recognized until people just start listening to a lot more music. And so once you've listened to a whole lot of music, then sort of finding that rare Stevie Wonder isn't a big deal because everybody's listened to all Stevie Wonder. So now you have to find what inspired Stevie Wonder that he sort of ripped off a little bit and then did this, and then you can hear that Stevie Wonder in this song. And so I think that's a kind of new form of artistry that comes out as the audience becomes more sophisticated, as an example.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey there, my name's Luke. I'm actually a startup technology recruiter here in Tokyo.
Okay.
I was at Sepang and I've been going to Bonobo for years as well, so I was really happy to see that on the screen. Actually, half of me was like, don't tell anyone, for God's sakes.
I know.
But yeah, I found your conversation extremely inspiring, and it spawned a lot of ideas. And I wonder, something that kind of came to mind while you're speaking was, I wonder if we're going to see I agree that I think music and entertainment, I studied acting in the performing arts for many years myself, that those will become free. And as we're already seeing is, eyeballs are what counts, or the spread of information, and like we all want to tell our secret, we all want to share our experience. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that a possible flip in the major social media players, perhaps of our Facebooks or our Instagram or whatever it may be, in moving towards that virtual world where, right now I think a lot of businesses or a lot of experiences are happy for us to quickly document what we're doing, what we're seeing, and whatnot. But I'm wondering if there's a possibility in your mind that could end up being a monetized value, where Facebook is actually taking micro payments for you. Publishing a picture at that AKB 48 event, instead of and taking little micro payments along the way through GPS and through other types of technology, because we're moving to how exciting our life is in a virtual manner anyway.
Right.
The first thing we do, check in, take a photo, this is where I am, this is how exciting my life is. And I think I agree in the sense that that's going to get more and more virtual. So I wonder if a micropayment system through, unfortunately, those three big players that we see them today are going to be the ones that kind of end up skimming that and making a monetized value for the artist. Because, agreeing with what you're saying, I think we're going to see more music the better, more art the better, but whatever's picking up momentum, then people are going to want to share it. Perhaps that medium of sharing it becomes a social media platform or something like that. That was just something that spawned through my mind while you're speaking.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. Sure, maybe. It goes a little against, could Facebook or Amazon or Apple, do more with, explicitly helping the artist somehow and making that part of it, and maybe micropayments is a way to do it. What I think a lot of people talk about, or one of the contrasts people draw attention to, is, say, iTunes versus Bandcamp. So Bandcamp, you can set your own price, and the musician gets a bigger cut of whatever you pay to that platform to buy a digital file of that music. But almost more importantly, the musicians get your email address, which is something that Spotify or iTunes doesn't do. If I listen to somebody, there's not a button to say, hey, give me up. I want to connect with this band, and I'll be part of their fan club, and I don't mind getting spam from them once in a while. And so those opportunities are there, and it could be, micropayments. And in terms of sharing, I think it's a little remarkable that we have so much sharing of images, but very little sharing of music. I mean, you can do it in Spotify, you can do it in Apple, but people don't do it yet. And I think partly it's not easy enough, or it's not fun enough. I'm not sure what needs to change. But I personally, I would love to be, I have a few friends, I hear a song, I say, I should zap this off to Mike, I should zap this off to Catherine. And it's not so easy to do that, and then the infrastructure isn't there so much. So to me, that's a big opportunity right now, especially because I think, part of the value of music is that, I come from the mixtape generation where I didn't buy any music till my mid-20s probably, because everybody was passing around tapes and mixtapes, And I remember getting mixtapes and not liking the music very much, but still finding it very interesting because it was from a friend. And I said, oh, I can't believe my friend likes this trash. But I should give it a try, or even J-pop, it was one of my rapper friends. I was like mouthing off about how stupid J-pop was. He says, you're an idiot, and I'm gonna play and make you a mix, and you gotta listen to it. And I had to admit, I was like, yeah, he might be right. So there's a big potential, I think, in there that's being held back because these platforms want to be in control. And frankly, I think this is what killed the recording industry. They wanted to be in control of that file. And they tried to hold on, they're still trying to hold on a little bit. And that was a mistake. And so that's why sort of what these underground DJs are doing. It's SoundCloud, it's touring. They maybe sell 500 records, but that's for their pride more than anything else. So yeah, it's interesting. Please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mortland. I'm a master's student. And I was just thinking about your explanation of the continuing CD sales in Japan being because of the things that come along with the CD sales. And I definitely agree that that's part of the picture. But I was thinking about, my own personal experiences living in Japan. And for example, like you buy CDs, at least up till a year or two ago, your options were CD or iTunes, and Japanese iTunes doesn't give you a discount for buying the whole album like other countries, so I wonder how much like the choices people make. I mean, you still go to like Tower Records and not all the CDs come with something, there's plenty of CDs there that don't come with anything. And also I was thinking about another difference. We have the big like resale market, like you go to Book Off and, well, like personally, it's like, well, I could buy this song digitally, or I could buy it cheaper, go to Book Off as long as it didn't come out in the past month and buy it cheaper. And I know your work's still in progress, but I wonder if you've like thought about some of these things.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent example of how sort of cultural norms and what we're used to and the environment, the kind of ecology of options varies so dramatically. And that's why I think the comparison is really interesting. And yeah, I do think there's a lot of that. I mean, I certainly have Japanese friends who say, I would feel bad. I'd feel bad downloading it, or I feel bad, watching it on YouTube and not paying for it. And I appreciate that. I think it's absolutely the right way to go.
But I wonder if it has something to do more with sometimes like the history of piracy in Japan versus in other countries as well, or the differences in the strictness of the legal system and things like that.
It could be. It could be. So I wrote an article with many years. It's so obsolete right now, but I was very interested when Napster comes out in the U.S. 1999. Record sales plummet, and it's been sort of one of the puzzles of trying to understand piracy is, well, what can you compare it to, right? So the record industry always says every download is a lost sale, but we know that's not true. And yet it's hard to know, well, what's the right discounting to do on that math, because we can't really compare the world as it is with piracy with a world that doesn't exist without piracy. Except the interesting thing was 1999 to 2002, basically people weren't using Napster in Japan. So in that time frame, everybody was using the internet on their cell phones. They didn't have a lot of hard drives. It wasn't so easy to plug into your stereo system. And broadband wasn't as widespread in college campuses, for example. So here was a perfect test. I mean, the people were not downloading music from the internet in Japan from 1999 to 2002. So what happened to the recording CD sales in Japan? They dropped even more sharply. So it turns out actually piracy was still the issue. It just wasn't Napster for doing it. It was CD rental shops. It was CD burners were available, and people were doing it by CDs. And I, when I'm doing my interviews with music fans, and there was this way of talking to and say, man, this album is so good, I really want the master. I don't want to copy. And so like that was a new value you could make. It's like, well, I insist, I'm not just going to copy this one. So I don't know. My sense is that there's a little less of that, or there's a little more concern about that downloading and piracy, but not so much. But it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. It requires a little more study on my part, or whoever wants to look at it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Probably last question, right? We should probably do this? Okay.
Hi, I'm Bonnie. This is really tall. Oh my gosh, it's falling. I'm also just a random student. I was gonna ask, in America, it feels like the sort of community-based music has like a sort of anti-establishment kind of feel, like, you know, like we don't want to sell out, we don't want to be commercialized. Right. There's a lot of like house shows in Philadelphia and like very popular. It's just like a couple kids in the basement and like a bunch of people, and it's just like they don't really aim to like get big or anything. Does that exist in Japan too? Like this sort of aversion to being commercialized? That was my question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and sure, yeah, absolutely. You know, I do think even among the musicians who would take an anti-corporate attitude, and I don't know, as far as I know, I think that's probably a global phenomenon. And also among fans, we want authentic, real experiences. I don't think that has a national boundary. But I also think musicians would not be against reaching larger audiences. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing. And they might, you know, say they don't want to be in a stadium, and maybe they don't, or maybe they might. So I think that's where it becomes very interesting now, is to see how these, I agree with you, house shows are very interesting, and there's sort of these alternative pathways to support yourself, and the internet's really helping with that too. And this has been an argument that's been around for a number of years, that that with the internet, it's easier to connect with fans and set up tours, and that although people don't make money on their tours through Europe, now they can tour through Europe and set up a tour in ways they just couldn't before without a whole company doing it for them. So sure, I think it's interesting, and to me it's a very positive development. Like that's the example of audiences and people saying, hey, we could use my house. You know, I could set it up here. It'll make a mess for a couple days, but that's all right. But I want to do that. And I think that's a perfect example of how fans and audiences can take matters into their own hands. And yeah, saying it's anti-corporate is a good idea, because it's saying, you know, it shouldn't just be about making the money or making a profit. And I think that's very exciting. Thank you. I'm happy to answer more questions too if people want to come up and chat afterwards.
Thanks so much, Ian.
Thank you.